Welcome to Lesson 23 of Atonement Confirmation. This lesson is entitled Honoring Marriage. It's about the sixth commandment. The lesson question for today, on page 123 of your workbook, is how do I honor God's gifts of sex and marriage? At the beginning of the lesson, you see the sixth commandment. You shall not commit adultery. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we lead a pure and decent life in words and actions, and that husband and wife love and honor each other. To begin, we're going to look at Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 9, where Jesus teaches about marriage and divorce. In this reading, the Pharisees asked Jesus when it was permissible to end a marriage. They were really trying to trap him. Jesus' answer takes us back to the beginning, to creation, when God created man and woman and marriage as a special blessing for them. Pause the video here now to read Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. Number 1. When God established marriage at the creation, whom did he bring together into the first marriage? He brought Adam and Eve together, the first man and the first woman. Number 2. When people are united in marriage, how close do they become? Look at verse 5. In marriage, they become one person. No longer two, but one. Number 3, read Romans chapter 7, verse 2. When does marriage come to an end? God's intention is that marriage comes to an end when one spouse dies, either the man or the woman. And so marriage is one of our key terms today. The definition of marriage, according to the Bible, is this. It is a lifelong union between a man and a woman. Number 4, we're going to read now Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 2 through 5, and Psalm 127, verse 3, to find the three chief blessings of marriage. Pause the video here to read those verses. Each one of those passages has one of the three chief blessings. According to the Bible, these are the three chief blessings of marriage. They are companionship or friendship, sexual happiness, and children. In Genesis 2, verse 18, it says that it is not good for the man to be alone. And so God creates the woman for him, for them both to be companions in this life. And the companionship of marriage is a different kind of companionship than any other friendship. It is a close, intimate bond between a man and a woman. The other two chief blessings, sexual happiness and children, are also meant to be enjoyed within the bonds of marriage. Number 5. In our world today, many people, concerned only about satisfying their own desires, blatantly ignore what God says about marriage and sex. But God speaks very clearly. For whom only is sex a good thing and a blessing? It is for a husband and a wife in marriage. Sex with anyone who is not your spouse, whether you are married or single, is a sin. Number 6. Marriage is intended to last a lifetime, but sometimes it doesn't. Use verse 6 to help you define divorce. Divorce is ending a marriage before either person has died. Number 7. What did Jesus say is a permissible reason for divorce in verse 9? He says that sexual immorality is a permissible reason for divorce. We might call that cheating or marital unfaithfulness. When a person seeks the blessings of marriage with someone who is not his or her spouse. And so if one of the people cheats on the other, Jesus says that it is permissible for the one who was not cheating but cheated on to seek a divorce. He says that because when the person has cheated, they have already ended the marriage. They have already broken the vow. Of course, it's not required that the person who was cheated on seek a divorce, and that they may forgive the person and continue with the marriage, but Jesus says it is also a permissible reason to end the marriage. Number 8. Read 1 Corinthians 7, verse 15. Here, we're given another permissible reason for divorce. The other permissible reason for divorce is if one of the spouses abandons the marriage, whether they leave and move somewhere else or seek to end the marriage by not being present. We call that desertion. Desertion is abandoning the family by leaving or by destroying the loving companionship through violence. Number 9. To what other relationship does God compare marriage in Ephesians 5, verse 18b to 33? Pause the video here to read those verses. He compares it to Jesus' relationship with the church. Number 10. In a marriage, God creates a special relationship between a husband and a wife that is to be selfless and loving. According to what Paul said in Ephesians 5, verses 18b to 33, how should the husband and wife in a marriage treat one another? It says that husbands should love their wives as Jesus loved us. Jesus' love for us was to come down from heaven, to live a perfect life in our place, and to sacrifice himself on the cross for us. And so the husband's love ought to be sacrificial, willing to give himself up completely, even up to death. But because death is the extreme, that means all other love that comes from the husband ought to be sacrificial as well. Wives should love their husbands as we love Jesus. Our love for Jesus is shown by listening to him, by allowing him to lead us. It's not that the husband ought to dominate his wife, because in the end the husband is supposed to be sacrificing himself for his wife, not getting what he wants, but doing what is best for his family. In a perfect world, this relationship would work perfectly, of course, because the wives would submit themselves to their husbands, as it says in Ephesians chapter 5. But the husbands, recognizing that they are there to sacrifice themselves for their wives, would not use that as an opportunity to make their wives into their slaves, but instead raise their wives up as the goal for their marriage, to make her life better. You see how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, because of this sinful world, it does not work that way. It's only by faith in Jesus that we can recognize that these are how things are supposed to be, and this is how we're supposed to strive for things as well. But because we are also sinful, we struggle with this concept. The men struggle with sacrificing themselves for their wives. More often than not, husbands are going to be selfish because they are sinners. Wives struggle with submitting themselves to their husbands and allowing him to lead because, again, they are sinful and want to have all the control. You notice that on both sides, the key element, the cause, is selfishness. We're going to turn now to Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 20a, where Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of trying to sleep with her. After being sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph was purchased by a man named Potiphar. God blessed everything that Joseph did, so that he was promoted within Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife was sexually attracted to Joseph and urged him to sleep with her. Pause the video here to read these verses. Number 11. What did Potiphar's wife want Joseph to do? She wanted Joseph to have sex with her. One of our key terms today is adultery. Adultery is defined as having sex with someone who is not your spouse. There are other words for this as well. For example, the word fornication usually refers to two unmarried people who have sex with each other. But they all fall under this commandment, the sixth commandment, because God has designed sex for a marriage between one man and one woman. Number 12. Any number of bad things might have happened to Joseph if he had listened to Potiphar's wife. However, what is the main reason Joseph gives for not doing what she wanted him to do? Look at verse 9. Finally, he does not want to do this because he would be sinning against God. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 13b to 20. Pause the video here to do so. And then answer the question, how did Joseph exemplify the Apostle Paul's encouragement? Paul said, flee from sexual immorality. And Joseph ran out of the house. He didn't want to be tempted or let himself be tempted any longer. This is one of the keys to fleeing from temptation to break the sixth commandment. If we leave ourselves in situations where we are tempted by this, to have sex with someone who's not our spouse, to look at pornography, etc., it becomes easier and easier to fall into that sin because the temptation wears us down. And so Paul says, flee. Get out of there. Don't stay. You're not strong enough to resist on your own. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 13b through 20, which you just read, what makes sexual sins very serious? Paul says that sinning sexually sins against our own bodies, which are the temples of the Holy Spirit. Number 15. Jesus said it isn't only through the outward action of adultery that people break this commandment. Read Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, and see what else is a sin against this commandment. Jesus says that even looking at someone with the desire to have sex with the person is a sin against this commandment. And that applies to the thoughts as well. Just thinking about having sex with another person who's not your spouse is a sin. It's adultery. We call that sin lust. Lust is wanting to have sex with someone who's not your spouse. It doesn't mean necessarily acting on that desire, but having that desire and holding on to it is sinful. Number 16. Jesus said that even looking at someone with lust in your heart is a sin. That is the purpose of pornography or porn. Pornography is media designed to create lust in our hearts, whether it's pictures or video or books or whatever. It is sinful to look at these things because they create lust in our hearts. Number 17. Because pornography is designed to stir up lust in us, how should we treat it? We should treat it as something dangerous and to be avoided. Nowadays, they've done research and have shown that pornography addiction has become one of the major problems, both in our country but also around the world. That pornography is just as addictive as some illegal drugs. And so we want to avoid it so that we don't become entrapped by it. Before we go on to number 18, there is a box on page 125 called Sins of Lifestyle. It says, sin is sin in God's eyes. No sin is better or worse to God. After all, His law demands perfection. Anything we do to break His commands, whether we would call them big or little, make us worthy of the same punishment, of eternal damnation to hell. When we live with someone who is not our spouse, or engage in homosexuality, those are examples of lifestyle sins. They're especially dangerous, because as long as we are living in them, we are not repentant. While none of them are unforgivable or worse than any other sin, they do not bring any greater punishment. Their constant presence in our lives is a constant threat to the health of our faith. Despite what the world around us says, we want to join with the Apostle Paul in encouraging ourselves and others to flee from sexual immorality. Lifestyle sins have no place in the Christian's life and even threaten the health of our faith. We want to stay far away from them. Turning now to number 18. Read Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and Romans 1, verses 24 to 27, to help you define homosexuality. Homosexuality is being sexually attracted to a member of the same sex rather than a member of the opposite sex. It is important to distinguish between the temptation of homosexuality and the sin of homosexual thoughts and actions. Review Romans chapter 1, verses 24 and through 27, and read 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. And answer the question, what does God say about lustful homosexual thoughts and homosexual actions? He says clearly that they are sinful. They are sins. It's important to distinguish between the lustful thoughts and the actions in homosexuality and the temptation, because it's not a temptation, it's not a sin to be tempted, but it is a sin to act on that temptation. Number 20. Read Ephesians chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, and answer the question, how do we show that we take the sixth commandment seriously? We do this by avoiding any kind of sexual sins, or even by giving the appearance of sexual sin, whether it's joking about sex or giving the impression that we're having sex, that is, living together without being married. You could easily say, we're living together, but we're not having sex, but to the outside world, everyone on the outside looking in, it would appear that you are indeed having sex. As Christians, we don't want to give that impression. Number 21. According to Hebrews 13, verse 4, who needs to be concerned about keeping the sixth commandment? Everyone. Not just married people, not just single people. Everyone. Marriage should be honored by all, as the gift from God that it is. Number 22. How does the sixth commandment serve as a mirror for us? How does it show us our sin? It shows us that our hearts and bodies are inclined toward abusing God's gift of sex and marriage as we grow up, whether that's by looking at porn or just thinking about people in inappropriate ways, thinking about them lustfully, whether it's having sex outside of marriage or having sex with people we're not supposed to have sex with. Number 23. How did Jesus keep the sixth commandment in our place through his active obedience? How did he keep God's law for us? Jesus kept this commandment perfectly by never sinning sexually in action, word, or thought. Number 24. How did Jesus solve our continued breaking of the sixth commandment through his passive obedience on our behalf? What did he do to take away the punishment for our sin? Jesus died to pay the punishment for any sexually related sin. And so the place where we go to deal with this sixth commandment is to Jesus' cross, where this perfect man who never sinned in any sexual way died to take the punishment for sexually related sin. And because of this, we are forgiven. Number 25. How does the sixth commandment serve as a guide for us? In Thanksgiving, we will respect God's gift of sex as he intends, only within marriage. Here again, we see the cycle. Because though we, as Christians, want to respect God's gift of sex, there will be times when anyone fails to keep God's sixth commandment perfectly. And then the law will act as a mirror, showing us our sin, sinners in need of forgiveness from Jesus, which he freely offers because he has kept this law perfectly for us and died on the cross to take away the punishment. On page 127, there's a chart that says God's gift of marriage. It is unique in that it is a lifelong union between one man and one woman. It is established by God, not by human beings. It provides the foundation of family life. It offers the blessings of companionship, sexual happiness, and children. And so, forgiven by God for the sins we have committed, out of thanksgiving, we want to be pure in thought, word, and deed, to seek a spouse in a God-pleasing way, love and respect our spouse, and flee temptation. We do not want to destroy companionship, to be unfaithful. We are not seeking to end marriage without reason, with divorce. We will not have premarital sex or practice homosexuality or view pornography, have impure thoughts and words, joking about sex. All these things because we have been forgiven for these things, for not doing what we should and for doing what we shouldn't. And so our lesson question for today. How do I honor God's gifts of sex and marriage? I do so by keeping the gift of sex within marriage, not making jokes about sex, and if married, being faithful to my spouse for life. That's our lesson for today. Please do the work on the Moodle site as well as the memory work. We'll see you next time.